So we're going to end up finishing up on the cultural resistance to change and ways to possibly think about changing cultures and a couple of the techniques that are often used in organizational development. So again, just to reiterate, we are on the first of 5 phases of going through organizational development, but one of those first phases is identifying whether the culture itself needs to be changed. In other words, do we need to create an intervention to first change the culture to allow additional innovations throughout the organization to be more likely or more successful to succeed? And if the answer to that is yes, that cultural change is going to be its own OD process that's going to go through all 5 stages. So this is just a recognition that cultures typically are naturally resistant to change, and that one of the first things we need to do is to change the resistant culture to a culture that supports change. And changing culture is not easy. It is a time-intensive process. Time is required, and it's also an iterative process. So a lot of times, some of the tools we use, for example, changing managerial tactics, changing role modeling, changing the actual structure and what's communicated, is also going to be occurring as we bring in new employees. It can also be effectively almost a generational project, as people that resist the change so much, in other words, they don't like the new culture, will self-select out of the organization. As the culture is being cleanly communicated, employees that are likely to enjoy that culture are more likely to apply and accept job positions. So there's going to be an actual, almost organic train structure over time reacting to a successful organizational change. And a successful organizational change is not going to be without trauma. There are going to be some employees that are going to be not only resistant to the change is going to create an organization that they're no longer comfortable with, and a recognition that this is going to be a natural part of that process. What we want to do, though, is to hopefully minimize those negative effects by clearly communicating the need for the change, why the change is occurring, and how the change is not only going to help the organization, but also help the actual individual employees within. So culture can prevent companies from adapting, and that's why we're really wanting to focus in on it. And again, just a reminder that multiple reasons can cause a need for change, but cultures typically don't actually take this into account. So recession in the environment, deregulation, technological upheavals or improvements, social factors within how the organization is being viewed, both internally and externally, global competition, outsourcing departments, markets within the organization's primary product lines. All of these can cause change. However, if an organization is resistant to change, it's going to be less successful in adapting to those. So we're just going to briefly talk about a couple of tools that we can use to actually kind of change the structure of an organization, which also will have the effect of changing the actual culture within that organization. One tool that has been found to be fairly effective at changing organizational culture quickly is informational change. And now that is basically providing both more information, but also providing the ability to gather information and the ability to make decisions at a much lower level within the organization. Probably one of the most radical of these changes is often referred to as open book management. And this is the idea that we want to inspire and teach employees to act like owners. And in order to do that, you have to provide those employees with a fair amount of actual information of the organization's basically best kept secrets, the books. So what are the profit margins? What are the goals of the organization? How much money is being put into each department? Which also means that instead of some employees being in the dark as to, for example, why a bonus isn't being shared at the moment, they can actually look at the books and be taught how to understand those books to basically recognize what's actually occurring in the organization. Now, there's often a natural resistance to this in top level management. Where it has been implemented, it's usually been implemented in relatively flat and smaller organizations. And there's a fair amount of research that indicates that this is a great way to increase a strong, positive culture. That people now are actually being trained in how to understand the overall business model and the books, if you will, of that business model, which means they are much easier and have a higher capacity to understand why decisions are being made, and often are even asked to make those decisions at the level that they're at. Tools for change include mainly a recognition beyond that of the support and resources necessary to actually initiate change. So change within a culture does require effort, materials, and resources. So support and collaboration from other departments. So departments need to support each other, and organizational cultural change needs to be occurring throughout all departments within an organization. The management needs to support and provide a climate of change and a climate that supports risk-taking and innovation within the actual boundaries of what the company is needing and the company's goals. And again, that means that management needs to be given the resources, both time and sometimes monetary resources, to support risk-taking. Innovative programs for providing resources includes venture capital and innovation banks, but this is basically about recognizing that if you're actually doing any intervention in an organization, that intervention is going to require monetary funds, it's going to require equipment, materials, and staffing hours. And how to provide that information and how to provide those tools to the management to be able to do these changes is one of the challenges of creating the support for change. Venture capital and innovation banks basically refers to internal organizational structures that allow funding both in time, equipment, and staff, and sometimes monetary money to support innovative new ideas. So a good example of this actually within the university that I'm currently employed, I recently came up with the idea of creating a series of short skill-focused modules that could be taken both by students at SIUE, but could also be offered to non-students for like additional professional development. Well, that was a fairly innovative idea, and when I took it to my dean, my supervisor, basically one of the things for that to happen, it required equipment. So the equipment to actually create these classes online and outside of the typical way that online classes are delivered at SIUE. In other words, Blackboard requires you to be an enrolled SIUE student. These classes would also be available to non-SIUE students, which means that we needed additional software. There needed to be staffing, so I couldn't create these classes on my own. There needed to be a devotion of mostly IT, so instructional technology support, but also additional staff beyond myself to help create the content of these classes. To create that, we needed funds. So basically, there needed to be money set aside to help develop these classes, to pay outside experts to review these classes. Overall, if there was no support structure, that innovative idea would have never moved forward. Fortunately, my organization actually has they don't call them an innovation bank, but there is a line in the budget of discretionary funds for new programs. And that allowed my dean to make a decision, this is a good idea, and to create a plan of how are we going to fund this project to make it actually happen. And that's what we're really talking about, is you can talk all you want about a culture of innovation and change and a culture of adaptation and a culture of risk-taking. But if anyone that comes up with a new idea immediately hits a wall of, sorry, no staff, no funds, no equipment, no materials, but see if you can do it without any of those things, you're effectively going to create a culture that is basically a strong culture that is destined to fail. So I think this is the best way to think about this is a reminder that creating a culture of innovation and risk-taking is the first step. There also needs to be the support structure to support that innovation. So again, you want to just think about the organizational dimensions that affect performance. So managerial effectiveness, do you actually have the managerial staff that have the goals to understand what are the goals and objectives of the organization, but also the time, materials, and resources to push those goals? How efficient is management being done within an organization? So the ratio of results to resources, how many managers and what's their span of control, how many direct reports they have. And finally, that motivational climate, employee attitudes that influence performance. So we're going to wrap up this week actually moving away from talking about organizational change from a cultural viewpoint and some of the resistance to change and the various models to conceptualize how change needs to happen in an organization, and just kind of talk about the professional values and ethics of an OD professional. And I really want to think this is mainly kind of focused and written both in the book and in the lecture slides to talk about an external organizational development professional coming into an organization and how to kind of navigate the values of not just the organization, but the values of organizational development. Organizational development is a field with its own assumptions, ethics, and values. But I think these equally apply to even if you're doing OD in an internal organization, so you're a part of the organization and you're moving it forward that way. And really, the first part of those values and ethics is an understanding that an OD professional needs to have expertise. So they need training, they need to know what they're doing. This is a systematic process that has been developed over decades through research and basically trial and error practice, but also the measurement of the success of these various programs and interventions. There needs to be a commitment to the actual goals of organizational development, to move an organization not to just reacting suddenly to change, but creating the systems to create a culture and a systems throughout the organization that allows adaptation, innovation, and the appropriate level of risk taking. And as a part of that, there's also some assumptions of what are the right ways to do OD, which involve autonomy of the person doing the OD. In other words, the ability to fight for what's right and also to follow these ethical guidelines. So OD implementation, the success depends on the congruence between the values of OD and the organizational values. So OD, again, is making some pretty big assumptions as a field. The assumption is that you want adaptation, you want clear communication, you want the value and respect of the skill sets of the employees that you have, and you want to create an adaptive structure where everyone in the organization, to some level, is being rewarded for being on the lookout for change, being innovative, and being willing to adapt to changes as necessary for the organization. So do those values match the organizational's values? And this is really at the heart of what I've been talking about for this week's lecture, is this idea of, do you have a culture that is open to OD? So a key issue is the fit between the practitioner and the client. And in this case, what we're talking about is the OD specialist, whether they're external or internal, the practitioner, or the OD team, and the client, in this case, the actual decision-making units of the organization itself, the CEO, the president, the board of directors, the leaders. So is there a compatibility of values between the practitioner who is pushing an OD implementation and the actual organization's leaders? How is this change being brought forth? Is it being brought forth organically? In other words, trying to communicate throughout the organization, let us as an organization change, or is it being imposed by those top-level leaders? If it's being imposed, are they willing to role model the changes that they want to see throughout their organization? And finally, what are the priority of those goals? So what is the end result? What is the purpose of these changes? And do those goals match also the ethics and basically expertise and code of values of OD itself? So compatibility of values, practitioners do differ on the degree of congruence with client values. And what I mean by this is there's kind of two broad schools of thought. Some practitioners believe that personal values must be compatible with the client. In other words, for ODs to succeed, they believe that there has to be the values of OD, the values of the practitioner, the person doing the organizational development, whether it's internal or external, and the values of the client, the organization, need to be in strong congruence for OD to work. Other practitioners take us, I guess, what I'd call a more practical or generally not necessarily practical, but just realistic approach, that as long as we're helping a client move closer to an OD viewpoint and the operations are legal, we're still ethically fine. So you have the two views of the first job is to ask, is the organization ready to be, so the first one, that compatibility, is the idea of identifying, is the organization ready and the culture open to OD? Is the values of the organization congruent with the values of organizational development? Excuse me. While the second one is, as long as there's some level of culture that allows some movement towards OD values and ethics, it's still worthwhile to continue to move in that direction. So with imposed change, again, OD ideally is implemented voluntarily. And what I mean by voluntarily is that the culture itself is created that pretty much everyone in the organization is open to innovation, adaptation, and change. And the entire organization is being empowered to analyze its environment and to be at least able to suggest changes that would make the organization more successful. The reality, though, is that often, at least initially, OD interventions are being driven by top management imposing that program. And therefore, organizational development practitioners need to be cognizant of the power and politics involved. And the fact that, again, in that situation of top management imposing programs, there is going to be more resistance. And that's one of the reasons why we've been talking about this idea that probably the initial thing we often want to do is try to actually change the culture to one more of that first one, where everyone is going to be open to these changes and they are voluntary, even though we realize they're still being driven by top management. We also want to make sure the priority of our goals are clearly defined. So determine goals given precedence. So are we focused on effectiveness goals? Are we focused on efficiency goals? Are we focused on satisfaction goals within the organization? So are our goals to, for example, increase retention, increase job satisfaction? Are our goals to actually increase efficiency? So basically production numbers, or is it a goal towards effectiveness, so quality of product? And the challenge is to develop a balanced intervention, one that improves productivity while also improving the quality of work for its members. And that's one of those key values of OD. OD at its best is not only increasing the productivity, effectiveness, and efficiency of the organization, it should also be balancing interventions that increase the satisfaction of the quality of the work of the members. And that's going to lead us to our core organizational development values. So basically, those core values are respect for people, a trust and support, power equalization, confrontation, and participation. And again, an OD professional should ask, do these values match well to the current organizational values or culture? So respect for people. Individuals should be allowed to function as human beings. They are perceived as responsible and authentic and caring and should be treated with dignity and respect, not just as resources. So is the intervention actually basically optimizing individuals in a way that allows them to add more to the organization? There's a value of trust and support. That the way to create a healthy organization is to create one that has open communication and a supportive climate. And basically that characterization of trust means that upper management is sharing information with the lower levels and lower levels are sharing information with the upper levels. There's a bit of an organizational value of power equalization. In other words, not necessarily creating a complete open democracy for all decision making, but a lesser reliance on hierarchical authority and control. Basically asking the questions, what power can be shared or seceded to lower levels in a way that allows the people that actually are needing to make decisions day to day having more ability. You've probably all gone into a store where you've had a somewhat unique problem for customer service. Maybe you have an issue with how an advertisement was communicated, or there's a sale flyer that says one price and another price is actually what's on the product. And you talk to the person, and the person is unable to help you. They basically say, I'm sorry, I can't do anything. That's an example of basically power unequalization. That employee needs to have some ability to make decisions at that level to increase customer service and the customer experience. And if they don't have it, it's going to lead to negative effects. You mean angry, having to find a manager, or maybe sometimes even finding that the person that can make the decision on the miscommunication of the cost of a product may not even be on site at the moment. So power equalization is about asking the question, can we give the person that is in direct contact with the decision a mismatch between prices, both advertised and what's on the product, and the customer at that moment? Because if you can do that and you're willing to give that trust and support, you're also going to increase the productivity and the overall customer satisfaction of people at your organization. Confrontation, you want to provide an environment of open communication where problems are not swept under the rug. Issues and strategies need to be openly confronted and decided. So confrontation isn't a negative confrontation. Confrontation is about actually recognizing problems and willing to bring them up and not being punished for them. So again, a lot of organizations have a heads down approach. People recognize that if they bring attention to a problem, they're often considered to be a part of the problem. Why are you making us aware of this? Why are you bringing this forward? So an OD value is to create a culture where confrontation of problems, recognizing them and bringing them up, is rewarded. And finally, participation. provides opportunities for individuals to develop their full potential, and that most people affected by the change are involved in decisions leading to that change. That doesn't mean, again, democracy, but that does mean at least surveys, opinion polls, basically ways for individuals in the organization to have a voice in what's occurring. I'm going to end up with just another quick example of an OD application. Trilogy University is a software company, and it's small but manages to compete fairly successfully with large companies. And their key goal is to attract talented people, so that's their main culture. And they foster new methods and relationships with clients and employees. And they've really put a lot of effort into how they bring people into their organization as a way to build its culture. So basically, they operate a 3-month-long boot camp with new employees being integrated into the company where they learn the values and the culture, but also the processes of the organization, and receive comprehensive evaluation and feedback on how they're actually interacting. So it's a 3-month period where they're under intense observation, but that observation is to teach them how to actually interact within the organization and to give them the skills to foster that relationship between clients and employees. Program provides sources for renewal, provides new services and products, and also, again, fosters that idea of innovation and change and adaptation. It also creates relationships, and even the new leaders are often identified through this process of the organization. So again, it's kind of a networking to where everyone that comes out of this boot camp has a strong connection to everyone that have been brought in at the same time. So this is just one example of a way to kind of operationalize or implement a change in culture and to make sure that that cultural change is quote unquote sticking.